Welcome, everybody. This is a timely and important panel. For decades, various American leaders believed that they could counter Russia's expansionary and aggressive foreign policy through international agreements and accommodating what they saw as the Kremlin's legitimate security concerns. But strategic narcissism blinded those who were hopeful about warm relations with Russia because they failed to consider adequately the ideology, emotions, and aspirations that drove and constrained Vladimir Putin's strategy toward the United States and Europe in particular. Since he ascended to power when President Boris Yeltsin resigned unexpectedly on the last day of the 20th century, Putin's goal has been to return Russia to great power status. But with a declining population, dwindling influence, and a weak economy, the country can't compete directly with the United States and Europe. So Putin adopted a strategy to drag others down to Russia's level, sow division, weaken rival states, and unravel alliances that give other states strategic advantages. Foundational to that strategy are disinformation campaigns designed to destroy trust in democratic principles, institutions, and processes. Russian disinformation is really cyber-enabled information warfare, designed primarily to shake citizens' belief in their common identity through the manipulation of social media, the creation of false stories, and the creation of false personas. Emphasis is on widening divisions related to race and divisive political issues such as immigration and gun control. The objective is to incite fear and anger on the far right and on the far left in a way that leaves the American people polarized and pitted against one another. So this is a great panel to help us understand how should we defend against Russia's sophisticated form of aggression. Perhaps most important, the United States and Europe must generate the will to counter Russia's toxic combination of disinformation and denial and its use of disruptive technologies. Of course, Vladimir Putin will not be in charge of Russia forever. A post-Putin Russia should know that it would be welcomed into the Euro-Atlantic security system that aims to preserve peace and promote prosperity. No one saw the threat from Putin's Russia more clearly than Senator John McCain. And this panel is a great way to honor him. Over to Bill Browder.
My name is Bill Browder. Thank you for joining us today. For those of you who don't know me, I am the person behind the Magnitsky Act, which is a piece of legislation that Vladimir Putin probably hates more than anything else. Sergei Magnitsky was my lawyer in Russia. He exposed corruption. He was subsequently arrested, tortured, and killed 11 years ago. And since then, I've made it my life's work to get the Magnitsky Act passed and to hold Putin accountable wherever I can. And so I'm delighted to be here to talk about Russia today. I thank Cindy McCain and the McCain Institute for organizing this event, and I thank the McCain Institute for gathering together such an esteemed panel of guests. To introduce the guests on this call, first we have Senator Menendez, who is chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, an extremely experienced politician and an extremely experienced statesman when it comes to Russia. And we'll be very much looking forward to hearing his comments. We have Congressman Kinzinger from Illinois, who also joins us. He is one of the bravest members of Congress, standing up for principle, standing up for his ideals. And we saw that during the last administration when he wasn't afraid to stand up to Donald Trump when he disagreed with what he was doing. And I'm a great admirer of him for that. And last but not least, Vladimir Milov, who is the former energy minister of Russia, who saw the terrible path that Putin was taking it down and has now become a member of the opposition. And in this really very worrying moment in Russia, it'll be very interesting to hear Vladimir's views on what's going on. I don't think we could really have this conversation without starting off with the elephant in the room, which is Alexei Navalny. As all of you know, Alexei Navalny is currently on a hunger strike. He's literally on death's door right now. Vladimir Putin tried to assassinate him with Novichok through his secret police 8 months ago. He survived. He's now back in Russia. He went back to Russia after being threatened, and he's probably going to die if something is not done dramatically to save him. And so the first question I have for the panel, and I will start with Senator Menendez, is there were some sanctions already imposed. That hasn't changed anything. What more can be done? What more should be done? If Alexei Navalny dies, what should the US reaction be? And anything else you can add on this really heartbreaking subject?
Well, thank you, Mr. Browder, and it's good to be with my fellow panelists. It's a great group of people, and I appreciate the McCain Institute bringing us all together. I serve with Senator McCain, and on the question of Russia, there was no one who was more direct and forceful about what the U.S. role should be. Look, the ongoing abuse of Alexei Navalny is appalling. And I share your concern and your allusions to parallels to Sergei Magnitsky. Allowing medical treatment and care is a humanitarian issue, not a political one, in addition to the fact that, of course, that he shouldn't be in prison at all. I'm glad the Biden administration sent a clear signal that it will hold Russian officials who abuse their people accountable with some of the March sanctions. But that signal just has to be a first step. And in this case, joining with the European Union to send very clear and powerful messages is incredibly important. I think Treasury should be reviewing the list of 35 Putin oligarchs that Mr. Navalny and his team have flagged as sanction targets. But given Mr. Navalny's current situation, the immediate targets of new sanction need to be his jailers. The Magnitsky Act, as you well know, was created in response to exactly this type of abuse. So those are some of the things I'd like to see the administration move forward, do it rapidly, and send a very clear message, hopefully in a multilateral way, that it is going to be held on Putin if something happens to Mr. Navalny.
Congressman Kinzinger, how do you feel about this?
Well, thanks, Bill. By the way, you get a lot of credit for where we're at, and I appreciate your hard work and continuing hard work. Vladimir, it's great to be with you. Thank you for your kind of strength of character, I guess is probably how I can put it most accurately. And Senator, great to see you. Thanks for your leadership on a lot of these issues. I also want to say just on to the McCain Institute, thank you. And thank you for continuing the amazing legacy. John McCain was a hero of mine. When I got elected, I got to know him well. I traveled with him. We have a lot of funny stories together. And if I can even, replicate 10% of the honor that he showed, it would be a career worth it. But, look, as the senator said, I agree with everything he said. I think what's clear is, we are up against a Russia that will push as far as they can until they meet significant resistance. We all know Vladimir Putin's a smart guy. He doesn't want to put himself in a position where he loses, but he will advance until he hits a brick wall. And so I think that's going to include, again, looking at his oligarchs, being very clear about exposing to the Russian people the kind of abuses, the $1 trillion of wealth that has been stolen from Russia. Those are the kind of things that I think would put Vladimir Putin on edge. He fears losing control, which is, I think, part of the reason we see the buildup on Ukraine's border is to try to, in essence, kind of change the narrative. But I also think we have to look beyond just kind of the immediate sanction side of things when it comes to, really dealing with Russia largely, and especially with Navalny, is there are Russian forays into the world everywhere. And as we all know, it's kind of this below the threshold fighting that Vladimir Putin does, the little green men. We know about the Wagner Group, their actions in Syria, Libya. We look at Venezuela, pretty much everywhere. And so I think seeing this as a battle, in essence, around the world and engaging in other areas outside of just sanctions. So if you have, Russian little green men, for instance, working in Libya, and they're not officially Russian soldiers. There's areas where we have to look at maybe, potentially targeting stuff like that. So there's a lot, I think, of options at our disposal. But the real key to all of this is we need Europe and we need the US to be unified. And that's why we need to stress the importance of NATO. That's why we need to stand with partners like Georgia, who's dealing with a third of their country being occupied, standing with Ukraine and everywhere else, and making it very clear that this is a broad engagement. And we take the Russian threat seriously and we stand up to it.
Great, thank you. And Vladimir, you bring a Russian perspective to this conversation. What's going to happen on the day that there's now a call for a major demonstration? What's going to happen, and how is that going to play itself out, and how is Putin going to react?
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's a great honor to be part of such a distinguished company. It's going to be a clash. It's going to be a clash. Essentially, what is happening right now is that was long in the making. It's a direct clash between forces who are really tired of Putin's mafia rule for over 20 years, and the mafia government, which shows that it wants to maintain the grip on power at any cost, pretty much in a similar way that Lukashenko did last year in Belarus. So it's going to be a clash. Remarkably, on the 21st, Putin has scheduled his annual address to the Federal Assembly. Well, as a matter of fact, we don't have much of a parliament left in my country. There is no federal assembly as such. There's just a bunch of androids who are appointed by the presidential administration rather than elected in a free and fair elections. We haven't seen free and fair elections in more than 20 years in Russia. So essentially, they're going to be listening to Putin announcing some major plans. There are wild speculations about what that might be, but the issue that Putin is facing a very difficult parliamentary election in September with all the control that he exerts. He cannot go against the tide of his approval ratings hitting historic lows and Russians being sick and tired of many years of stagnation, economic decline, lack of positive prospect. So there are many rumors in Moscow that Putin might deliver another, geopolitical gift to the Russian people, whatever that might be, declaring an occupation of another part of Ukraine. Or, that Belarusian dictator Lukashenko has announced recently that he made some historic decision of a lifetime, might be as well something about an occupation of Belarus. We don't know. What we do know is Putin is preparing for some sort of historical move. At the same day, obviously, Moscow will turn one more time into a fortress because opposition have scheduled a rally in support of releasing Alexei Navalny and stopping this inhumane treatment, which he currently encounters. So there's going to be a clash. I think you will see another day of pictures of, Moscow filled with heavy armored trucks, riot police, maybe, I don't know, maybe even some army vehicles or whatever. And Putin will deliver his fortress heavily guarded, will deliver his address in a heavily guarded fortress with his bunch of loyalists. So this is, I don't know, this will probably won't be a better picture of a contrast between two different Russias. Putin's mafia, which has captured the country and is not giving up power despite calls for that from the Russian society, plus the Russian society, which is not afraid to go out on the streets and to demand change.
Just a quick follow-up. Do you think that Putin is more scared of Navalny living or dying?
I think, Bill, it would be fair to say he's just scared. He's just scared of the Russian people finally turning against him after all these years. So I think it's a hard choice for him, which is why he's hesitating to make an ultimate decision. because it's kind of stupid not to provide thorough medical assistance to Navalny in the current condition. There's a big risk that he would die, which will spark outrage. But he's also afraid of him being released and being out in the open as the open leader of the people. So that's, Putin is somewhat in between a rock and a hard place. He wants to maintain the strongman image, but he's not a strong man for quite a long time, save for all this armored stuff and the weaponry that he's preparing to use against his own people.
Yeah, that's what it looks like. So, the other big headline coming out of Russia is this massive mobilization of troops on the Ukrainian border. And I've got my own theory about this. I think that the Navalny situation is so upsetting for Putin and so scary for Putin that he needs to create a distraction. And I don't know myself whether it's just creating the distraction or whether he actually wants to go into Ukraine. But I guess the real question is, if he does go into Ukraine, what do we do? What does the United States do? What does Europe do? How do we respond? What tools do we have to respond? How do we deal with this? Senator Menendez?
Well, again, alliances are important. Well, this is one in which the European Union and others can play along with us a very strong role in sending a message to Putin that there will be real consequences for any possibility of a further invasion into Ukraine. I think one of the things that Putin should know is that in the Congress of the United States, Ukraine has bipartisan support. We may not have a lot of different areas of the world, but we have bipartisan support on the question of support for Ukraine. I know that I previously worked with Senator McCain on the question of the Freedom Support Act of Ukrainians and an advocate of selling, including offensive weapons as necessary. We are working now on the Ukraine Security Partnership Act, which is to bolster that support, which would authorize $300 million per year of foreign military financing to Ukraine, including lethal military assistance, and expedite the transfer of excess defense articles to Ukraine. And we're hoping to get that up and passed soon. In addition, I think that we should be pursuing freedom of navigation operations in the Black Sea as a method of pushing back on the disruption to Ukraine's commerce and standing up for Ukraine's sovereignty. Of course, follow on to the sanctions that President Biden levied earlier for the illegal actions in Crimea, especially in coordination with other partners in Europe and Canada. I think the confluence of all those things has to make Putin understand at what price does he pursue such an incursion, because I believe that he only understands strength. And unless he sees strength, then he will actually pursue potential invasion. So I think the amassing all of that is incredibly important at this time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Adam?
Yeah, so agreed. I think there's two options here, and one won't be as popular as the other. But the first is, at a very minimum, I think we need to make it clear that if Vladimir Putin engages with Ukraine further, that this will implement a massive united front in terms of ideas. We will aggressively, like we did during the Cold War, begin to make it clear, that we will fight for Western democracy in countries maybe where you have Russian influence. We will push back harder than we ever have. We will return to a massive operation of informing the Russian people just how corrupt Vladimir Putin and his cronies are. We will make it immediately clear that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline will not be completed, as it shouldn't be anyway. And it's one of the concerns I have is how long it has taken our administration to follow through on the mandated sanctions by Congress that can stop this from being completed. But beyond that, we will, as a united West, engage in energy security for all of us so that Russia can no longer use energy as a weapon. And we will begin to refocus on places like Georgia to make sure that their democracy is strong and pro-West, as well as any other sanctions, of course. On the other hand, I agree with FONOPS, Freedom of Navigation Operations, but I think we need to make it clear that there is a military option on the table if we go to that. What we're starting to see with Vladimir Putin is something of which you can compare to, Germany in pre-World War II, where it was just a little bit, and then a little bit here, and eventually people woke up to the threat that the Baltics, in this case, might be next, and we have all these other issues. So I don't, suggest stationing American military in Ukraine right now, but I think being prepared to have a military response if necessary with our allies is extremely essential to this, because look, Vladimir Putin knows that he will not defeat the United States and the West on the battlefield, but he thinks he can push to where we won't engage ever. As we saw in Syria when we took out a number of Russian mercenaries threatening U.S. troops. Vladimir Putin was pretty quiet in Syria for a while after that. We have the capability, and I think we need to make it clear that we're willing, not eager, but willing to use it if necessary.
But do you really think that we are willing to use it? So Vladimir Putin, the Russian military budget is 90% less than the U.S. military budget. Their economy is the size of the state of New York. If we ever actually stood up to him, he would back down in a second. But the reason why he does this stuff is that we really, it's kind of easy for all of us to say, but do you believe that the United States or any of our allies would actually, if he invaded, do anything other than some token gestures? Because that my fear is it's just going to be more, we've been here a bunch of times.
Yeah, and it's my concern as well, Bill, I'll tell you, and because I really do believe, and I'm not, eager to find ourselves in any kind of a shooting match or anything like that. I don't want to be misconstrued. But I also know, as Ronald Reagan always said, you have peace through strength. Being willing to use the military, if necessary, not eagerly, is actually makes war far less likely to happen. And we don't want to get to a point where then Russia decides we're not going to react in Ukraine, no matter what that reaction looks like. It doesn't necessarily have to mean an equal force reaction. And then he thinks that he can now take out the Baltics, for instance. And if he does, and we don't respond to that, it's the end of the NATO alliance and all effectiveness.
Yeah, that's true. So Vladimir, from a Russian perspective, it's a very costly exercise to go into Ukraine. Is this something that the Russian people would be happy about, or would they be condemning it, or what's going on from that perspective?
Yeah, Bill, costly is a very important word. That's a very, very important point. And I have been talking to some pollsters who were doing this. These are a bunch of the same people who do polling for various parties, depending on who pays. Like, I know some folks who've been working for Putin and United Russia in the regions. And believe me, there's an overwhelming negativity in the Russian society for spending more resources on wars, foreign invasions, financial aid to places like Crimea, Donbass, or Syria. Like 80% would say that we need to spend more money at home rather than on all these foreign adventures. That's a very important part, because Russian people in their great majority are essentially an ally of the free world, the global community, in terms of Putin's aggressive attempts and behavior being extremely costly for everyone, including us. Now, I wanted to go back also to this discussion and add you a couple of points which might help to get a better understanding of what Putin is up to. Despite his strongman image that he's trying to portray, who is being persecuted to a greater extent in Russia than the opposition? Relatives of the people who were killed in action in Donbass or Syria, relatives of the military servicemen. I'm not talking about Wagner and these mercenaries, because Wagner officially Russian propaganda saying that we don't know who these people are. But I'm specifically talking about relatives of official military servicemen who died in Donbass or Syria. FSB, Russian Security Service, come to their homes, threaten them, and say, if you speak out, you'll be punished, you'll be persecuted, you'll get, you lose any opportunity of a normal living forever. Why is that? Because Putin remembers Afghanistan, he remembers Chechnya, and he knows what it does to popular opinion when you start to do a body count. When a lot of dead people arrive back from foreign lands that you invade. He's very much afraid of that, which is, I would then go to argue that he actually stopped military incursion into Ukraine in 2015 after the Battle of Mariupol, when it became clear that urban warfare is a mess that will do a lot of harm to him vis-a-vis public opinion in Russia. So that's a very important factor. Of course, he's crazy. He might be up to absolutely anything. But when you're assessing what he's up to do and what can be the response of the free world, you always have to bear in mind and analyze that, like in Syria, he uses only air power and mercenaries. He's very afraid to send boots on the ground. In Donbass, he's like fiercely suppressing any rumors or information in public about people being killed in action, Russian servicemen being killed in action. So he's extremely afraid of public opinion. He's extremely afraid of anything like that turning into a bloody mess. So I don't think the West should be discussing him in terms of this, Kremlin-based strong man that is up to take the world tomorrow. No. He's a weak man. He's got a lot of weak points. He's got a lot to fear, and domestic public opinion in the first place. You should always remember that.
So as a betting man, it sounds to me like you would be betting that he wouldn't, this is just saber rattling, not that he's not actually going to pull the trigger and go further.
Listen, you cannot exclude an irrational element in this. Like late Boris Nemtsov, my co-author, used to say, well, I wouldn't repeat the language that he exactly used, but say, Putin is nuts. There's a widely circulating video on YouTube. So you cannot, we should always calculate the risks, and this element should not be excluded. But to me, it looks like it is more about some, relatively peaceful, not including direct combat action, but a relatively peaceful operation, more like Russian troops officially entering this occupied area of Donbass, and Putin said, we recognize them. Now we're not hiding anymore. We're there. There will be a Russian flag. We're going to recognize these territories, give them Russian passports. Here's a gift to you Russians in front of upcoming elections in return for a bad economic situation. At least you don't have anything to eat, but at least you have to be proud of something geopolitically.
Yep. So, Senator Menendez, you spoke about doing things with allies, and Europe, in theory, is our shared valued ally in this whole story. But Europe has been sort of a disappointment, and I've seen it up close and personal in my work trying to get the Magnitsky Act passed, and I it was passed in 2012 in the United States, and it took until 2020 in Europe. And one of the big problems with Europe is that it doesn't speak with a single voice. It speaks with 27 voices, and all 27 voices have to be in unison for them to make a decision. And that creates this hugely horrible leverage opportunity for little countries to hijack the whole foreign policy. And like Hungary, for example, Viktor Orban is a big friend of Putin's, and he can veto all EU legislation. And so if we're in a situation where we're being effective, where we're trying to be doing things in concert with Europe, and we have a country like Hungary or Cyprus stopping our foreign policy, at what point do we just go unilateral and just do what needs to be done, as opposed to holding out for a sort of broad-based alliance?
Well, Bill, look, we have very often in the past led unilaterally on the questions, particularly of the sanctions regime, and then others have joined. But I think we need robust diplomacy right now because, as we both know, multilateral sanctions have far more effect than unilateral sanctions. Our sanctions are pretty powerful because of the desire to be in the most significant marketplace and financial transaction capital of the world. But nonetheless, when they are multilateral, it's a lot more powerful. I'm glad to see, even though it took them time, that the European Union now has a human rights sanctions regime of its own. We got to get them to robustly use it. We have to think of our bilateral diplomacy with countries that create an impediment within the European Union and more robustly engage in that regard. But even when we can't partner with the European Union as a whole, we can partner with individual European Union members to impose sanctions and make the Kremlin pay for malign activities. And countries outside the European Union, like Great Britain, for example, can be an invaluable partner to standing up to Putin. So those are some of the things I'd like to see. But obviously, our values-based alliances are an important one. It's taken a beating over the last several years. We just can't say, okay, we're back and we're all together again. We're going to have to build that. But I think these are some good opportunities because I agree with the congressman on Nord Stream. We passed that out of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee sanctions. It had bipartisan support. That's a really powerful message to the Russians at the end of the day. And I hope that the administration will finally do what, my view, the previous administration waited too long to engage in doing. So we need that to be done. And I also think we need to deal with the question of cryptocurrencies as it relates to how do we avoid circumvention. And in this effort, not only do we have to do this domestically, but we see cryptocurrencies in other countries. China, for example, is developing their own. Not only is it a concern of the reserve capital of the world, which right now is us, but secondly, it can be used not only for tax evasion purposes, but more importantly for malign activities like money laundering and whatnot. So how we get that together and correct it is a tricky regime. But as a member of the Senate Banking Committee, I'm also looking at that because I think that's the next frontier of how people will evade.
I completely agree with you. And in fact, I'm amazed that people don't talk about it. I mean, if you go to the bank and you want to withdraw more than $10,000, you've got to write an essay about why you want to do that. And you get put, then they send a message to the regulators that you did that. But you can move $10 million in cryptocurrency and no one's asking any questions at all. That's just got to be regulated. I just can't imagine that in 5 years' time that we're living in a world where that's not regulated. And I know for sure that as the traditional money laundering systems that they used to use in Lithuania and Estonia and Latvia and Cyprus have been shut down, that the cryptocurrencies have now become a more the way that they're doing it. Adam, just to go back to Europe for a moment, I know you've been really, sort of vocal on the whole Nord Stream story. And I'm trying to understand, and maybe you have a perspective or an understanding that I don't. Russia has used natural gas as a weapon multiple times against Europe. And so the logic would be that a country that's been on the receiving side of that would not want to be dependent on Russia going forward, become less dependent. And so putting aside our interests for a second, I can't really understand how Germany would want to become more dependent on Russian gas and be fighting us on this. So how do you see this?
Yeah, I mean, look, I obviously share your confusion about that. I mean, we can go all the way back to, Germany closing their nuclear power plants, that affecting their ability to be carbon neutral. And then now importing gas from Russia still allows them to be carbon neutral because they're not producing it now. It's kind of a little trickery there. There's economic interest. And, all of us have to think through and resist certain economic temptations when it comes to standing up on foreign policy. For instance, I've been generally pretty impressed with Europe's reaction to China. I feared when COVID hit that China, and they would use that as an opportunity to further invest themselves in Europe with 5G, Huawei, everything else. And they've woken up. But, I think the thing to keep in mind too on Nord Stream, I think it was something like 350 to 100 was the vote in the European Parliament against Nord Stream in opposition 2 or 3 years ago. Most countries in Europe oppose Nord Stream. So when we think about, sometimes I can get in the habit of saying, well, Europe supports it, but we don't. And that's actually not true. You talk to most European countries, they're concerned with it. But it's going to take some real investment. And that includes by the Germans as well. My family, by the way, is German, so I can kind of hit your own or whatever. But, what it looks at is that includes upgrading, updating Eastern Europe gas infrastructure to be more competitive or more compatible. That's the word with us. Obviously our natural gas exports are important, helping Europe develop theirs better, as well as green energy and alternate energy. And I think we just have to all hold hands on this and have really a strong kind of alliance when it comes to energy. If you look at, for instance, Georgia and that whole region in the Caucasus, continuing to maintain their strength with us as Russia tries to go around them as a supply route. So I don't understand, besides the economics of Europe, of some in Europe's hesitancy, but I know we have the ability to stop this. And I know this is a moment where we simply just need to stop it. We have great initiatives like the 3 Cs initiatives, to help draw investment in and counter Russia as well, leveraging both the private sector and the government, which, as we all know, is the best way to do things. But on the original part of the question, I think the bottom line is this: we have to work with the broader European Union as often as we can. But as the senator said correctly, where we need to work individually with different countries, we have to do that as well. And not just on the Russia issue, but Russia, China, everything else, because we've taken the idea of Western democracy being safe. We've taken that for granted. And we're seeing now that in reality, Vladimir Putin can exploit things like cultural divisions like he does in our own country for his own benefit, and he's doing it in a lot of places.
This whole Nord Stream thing reminds me a little bit of this. I don't know if you remember, but back in 2013, the French government had contracted to sell 2 huge aircraft carriers to Russia.
Yep.
And then Russia took Crimea, invaded Ukraine, and they were still planning on selling the aircraft carriers. And finally, we finally had to beat them up so much that they ended up selling them to the Egyptians. And I guess the Egyptians had to learn Russian to operate them. But I kind of feel like that's where we are with Nord Stream right now. It's so out of sync with what's going on. It really kind of just perplexes me that the Germans are still so insistent on it. Vladimir, your part of your expertise has been focusing on Russian corruption, and same here. I've spent a lot of time looking at Russian corruption, and I don't know if these numbers are exactly correct, but I think about $1 trillion has been taken out of Russia from corrupt officials since the Putin regime began, and it's all been pretty well clarified that it was going through Danske Bank in Estonia and a bunch of these other banks in Latvia and Lithuania and Cyprus. And that's all been exposed and shut down. And we were talking about the cryptocurrencies a moment ago. How the corruption is still happening and the money is still being exported. Is it cryptocurrencies? Is it art? How do you see, because these guys aren't keeping their money in Russia. How are they doing it?
I'll come back to that in a second, but I'm tempted to comment also on the Nord Stream situation. I think what is a bit missing in this transatlantic debate on Nord Stream 2 is the German business angle, because this is actually what the Russians do. Yes, obviously, there are negative political consequences for Europe and Germany from over-dependence on the Kremlin in terms of energy. But what they do is they bribe specific companies. They say, your businesses operating in an energy import dependent countries, we help you to book cheap reserves. We help you to book cheap gas to be delivered to your customers so you get market advantage. And German businesses, they are very pleased with it. They are very pleased with the prospect that Germany would turn into a major redistributing hub for Russian gas after, let's imagine, Nord Stream 2 is commissioned. So German businesses are very happy. They go to their government and say, we have commercial interests, we provide you jobs, so you got to support this project. So I think this is being discussed a bit too much in a political sense, and less in a very practical sense of how do you work with German businesses to actually explain that there are better alternatives and they don't have to be lured simple into this Kremlin trap of offering them specific cheap gas for specific contractual relationships. Now, on corruption, I think the figure is right, $1 trillion. But that's only, we're talking about specifically $1 trillion of dirty money, which is really criminal money that were siphoned through all these schemes that we're talking about. What is far less addressed, and yes, I agree that they will be moving more because of the tightening of financial regulation in the Western systems, so they will be moving towards crypto. That's a no-brainer. But, however, I think what should be addressed is something that is considered by many as a legitimate inflow of Russian money. Now, the official figure of capital outflow from Russia during the Putin era is just another $1 trillion. This is not a criminal trillion. This is considered to be a pretty legit $1 trillion, which was simply classified as exported capital. Now, this is oligarchic money, which could never been earned in Russia without siding up with Putin, essentially, and providing major preferences to oligarchic structures and squeezing out competitors and creating this state-dominated economy that we are currently observing in Putin's Russia. So on paper, it's legitimate. As a matter of fact, this is a result of a preferential treatment of favoritism from Putin to very specific oligarchs. So I think it's when we speak about Chairman Menendez has been mentioning the list of 35, what this list is about. It's not just about revengeful attempt on some 35 individuals. These are people who are channeling large amounts of money into Western financial system with purpose to corrupt it, to get intertwined. So Western politicians always hesitate to take measures against Putin's arrogance and aggression. That is done specifically on purpose, and it's not a nominally a criminal activity. On paper, that's legitimate activity. I think we need a bit of reclassification here. I think we need to understand that this money is made not through a legitimate manner, but through monopolizing Russian economy, using Siloviki and all the methods of establishing control, squeezing out private businesses. I'm sure Bill Brauder knows a lot about that as well. So we need to reclassify that and say, listen, oligarchs are not legitimate businessmen. They do their dirty job of integrating Putin's economy into Western financial world. That's no good. That's enabling, and this has to stop. This is why we, the Russian opposition, call for sanctioning the oligarchs as probably the key step that should be taken at this moment.
I couldn't agree with you more. It's in 2018 when the I guess it was part of the Katsa Act, when they sanctioned the 7 oligarchs. That was like a neutron bomb going off over Moscow. And I think that was probably the single most powerful thing that the United States has ever done by going after Deripaska and all these other characters. And my theory on Navalny is the US should take this list of 35 and sanction 5 of them tomorrow. 5 of the 35 tomorrow while he's still alive. First of all, because they've tortured him. And second of all, to show that the list of 35 is a real list, and then another 30 to go, because that would stop Putin in his tracks. We're sort of coming towards the end of our session, but I thought I would just open this up a little bit to any other thoughts about how we contain Russia, how we address Putin. Any other thoughts that you have, and maybe start with you, Adam, and then we'll work our way around the panel.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. It's an honor to be here. This is a challenge. It's a challenge that we are totally capable of handling. And I just want to say that I can't wait for the day, even though I've never met you in person, Vladimir. I can't wait for the day when you can take me to Russia and show me around, and we can be there with a free and democratic Russia. And you can show me all the good sights and good vodka.
Senator Menendez.
Yeah, well, I'll join Congressman Kinzinger. So I look forward to visiting with Vladimir too, but I can't because I'm sanctioned by Putin, so I can't go to Russia. But at some point that will end. Look, I think this had been a great conversation, but we need a holistic approach to deal with Russia. We've got to think about our sanctions regime. We've got to think about getting other allies in common cause. We have to stop Nord Stream. We have to fund Ukraine so that there's real consequences. We mentioned body bags. If Ukrainians have the wherewithal to fight back successfully, even though obviously they would be outgunned if he wanted to be serious, if Putin wanted to be serious about it, but there would be real consequences. And that sense of strength would be I think a chilling. And I agree with you, Bill. I have urged the administration to pursue sanctions vigorously against oligarchs. And Vladimir's observation, I think, is very important. I think that is the heart of how Putin palpitates his economic resources and viability. And when you start severing some of those, you send a very clear message, as well as finally getting out there about Putin's own wealth in a way that I think would be, people like Vladimir I know, but I don't know if all the Russian people know. And if we did that type of job at the end of the day, I think there'd be a new Russian revolution. So in any event, those are just some ideas. And thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. Vladimir?
I'll just be very brief because many people think that domestic Russian policy developments are some isolated sort of thing, just another third world dictator going after his political opponents. They are not. It's all intertwined, domestic and foreign policy, because when Putin developed an appetite for total lawlessness and aggressive behavior unpunished, he began to export it. We actually warned about these things going to happen before the war in Georgia in 2008, before aggression against Ukraine in 2014. We told many Westerners that, look, this authoritarian consolidation of power will not just end up at home. Putin will become more aggressive internationally. So I think it's important to understand that we're all in the same boat. We are the free people of the free world fighting against this big autocrat international, which includes not only Putin, but also his friends in Beijing and other places. But that's a global thing. It's not just on domestic developments in Russia. It's not an isolated thing. It's part of democratic rule-based order versus total autocratic mafia-style dictatorship, which Putin and his friends want to impose all across the globe. We can't let that happen.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's back in the days of the Soviet Union, we had a containment strategy to stop communism from spreading around the world, and there's no longer the risk of communism, but we have the risk of klepto-fascism to spread around the world, and that's what Putin wants to spread. And I mean, it's remarkable that, in Myanmar, while everybody is condemning them, Putin is sending generals to their military parades and providing them with arms. And what it says to me, and I think what this sort of one of the summaries of this conversation is that we need to pursue a sort of policy of containment like we had during the Cold War, but it's containment of a criminal regime, not a containment of a political regime, and that's what this is all about. Well, it's been an honor to have such an esteemed panel today, and Senator Menendez, Congressman Kinzinger, and Vladimir Milov. Thank you all for joining, and again, thank you, Sidney McCain and the McCain Institute for bringing us all together. I think it's been a great conversation.